Hey there, Silver Recaps here. Today, we're bringing you a heartwarming story filled with nostalgia, mystery, and redemption. Let's dive into this tale that's sure to leave you inspired. The story begins with a young man named Craig who returns to his hometown after many years. Walking through the familiar streets, Craig is flooded with childhood memories. Some happy and some painful. He remembers the tragedy of losing his mother when he was just a little boy. Her death remains a mystery, and Craig has always blamed himself for it, carrying the burden of guilt throughout his life. In the same town lives a wealthy man named Mr. Harrigan, a devout believer in God. Every day, Mr. Harrigan visits the church for prayer, a ritual that keeps him connected to his faith. One day, while at the church, Mr. Harrigan notices a young boy telling a story to a small crowd. That boy turns out to be Craig. Craig's storytelling captivates Mr. Harrigan, leaving a strong impression on him. Later that evening, Mr. Harrigan visits Craig's home and offers him an unusual opportunity. He asks Craig to read books for him, explaining that his eyesight has weakened with age and he can no longer read on his own. As an incentive, Mr. Harrigan offers to pay Craig $5 an hour for his help. Appreciating the opportunity and the chance to earn money, Craig gladly accepts the offer. Craig begins visiting Mr. Harrigan's house, which is nothing short of a mansion. The house is equipped with every luxury imaginable, from grand architecture to modern facilities. Despite having 50 rooms, only 3 people live there: Mr. Harrigan himself, his gardener, and his maid. Craig visits the mansion 3 times a week to read books to Mr. Harrigan. Occasionally, as a gesture of appreciation, Mr. Harrigan gives Craig lottery tickets as a bonus. Initially, Craig is motivated purely by the money, but over time, a genuine bond begins to develop between the two. Mr. Harrigan, who once lived a lonely life, starts to enjoy Craig's company, and Craig begins to see him as more than just an employer. As 5 years pass, their relationship deepens. Curious about Mr. Harrigan's past, Craig decides to look him up online. He visits an internet cafe and searches for information about the mysterious old man. To his surprise, Craig learns that Mr. Harrigan was once a powerful businessman. However, his professional life was marred by conflict. The search reveals that Mr. Harrigan had a harsh reputation and strained relationships with his employees. Many of his workers despised him, and some even blamed him for ruining their lives. Despite discovering this dark side of Mr. Harrigan's past, Craig's opinion of him remains unchanged. To Craig, Mr. Harrigan is a kind and thoughtful man who has treated him with respect and generosity. As Craig grows older, he is now a teenager and enrolls in high school. On his first day, he meets Kenny, a boy who bullies him. Kenny says, "You need to clean my shoes." Craig refuses outright, saying no. Before Kenny can continue bullying him, their science teacher arrives, which forces Kenny to leave. Later, Craig shares everything that happened with Mr. Harrigan. Mr. Harrigan advises him, "You shouldn't deal with bullies with kindness, but with strength. Whether it's school, work, or business, you have to stand up for yourself." After a few days at high school, Craig notices how students are divided into groups based on their smartphone. Those with Samsung phones are in one group, Nokia users are in another, and students with iPhones are seen as the elite or cool kids. Feeling left out, Craig goes home and asks his father for an iPhone. His father firmly denies his request, saying, "You're too young to have a phone. Your focus should be on your study, not on the phone." Mr. Harrigan often gives Craig lottery tickets as small bonuses for his help. One day, Craig scratches a ticket and discovers that he's won $3,000. Overjoyed, he shares the news with his father, who surprises him by finally buying him an iPhone for Christmas. Craig is overwhelmed with happiness and hugs his father tightly. The iPhone feels like a major milestone for him. Excitedly, he uses his new phone to make his first call to Mr. Harrigan, saying, "The lottery ticket you gave me won $3,000, and I just got my first iPhone." The next day, Craig takes the iPhone to school, proudly showing it to his friends. He feels included for the first time and heads to the cafeteria, where the group of students with iPhones usually hangs out. Among them is Jennifer, a girl he has a crush on, making the moment even more special for him. Later, Craig's narration shifts to a reflection of his past. He shares, "Over time, I realized that without me, my old employers felt lonely and helpless. But without them, I was also incomplete." Moved by his bond with Mr. Harrigan, teenage Craig decides to gift him an iPhone, hoping to introduce him to new technology. More importantly, it would allow them to stay connected, as Craig deeply values his conversations with Mr. Harrigan. Initially, Mr. Harrigan hesitates and declines, saying, "I might get too dependent on it." However, after Craig patiently explains the benefits and convinces him, Mr. Harrigan finally accepts the iPhone. As time passes, Mr. Harrigan becomes increasingly engrossed in the device. He starts spending most of his time on the iPhone, gradually gradually losing interest in books. Craig notices the shift as Mr. Harrigan begins spending entire days glued to the screen. Unfortunately, with time, Mr. Harrigan's health deteriorates. His condition worsens to the point where he needs an oxygen mask to breathe. One day, as part of his usual routine, Craig visits Mr. Harrigan's house to read to him, only to discover the heartbreaking truth. Mr. Harrigan has passed away. He was alone at home, as both the gardener and maid were on leave. Shocked and grief-stricken, Craig calls his father, who advises, "Stay there until help arrives." Tears fill Craig's eyes as he sits beside Mr. Harrigan, mourning the loss of his closest friend. Though Craig knows Mr. Harrigan is no longer alive, he takes out a book and reads to him one last time, honoring their cherished bond. After Mr. Harrigan's passing, members of the community gather at the church to prepare for his funeral. The church is filled with people paying their respects. During the ceremony, Craig stands before everyone and reads a book in honor of Mr. Harrigan, just as he used to do for him. However, it's a deeply emotional moment for Craig, as he struggles to hold back his tears, overwhelmed by the loss of his closest friend. Before leaving, Craig approaches Mr. Harrigan's body one last time. Quietly, he slips the iPhone into Mr. Harrigan's pocket, wanting to ensure that the device they bonded over stays with him forever. After this, Craig leaves with his father, heartbroken. As they are leaving, Mr. Harrigan's personal finance manager arrives and shares some unexpected news. He tells Craig, "Mr. Harrigan left you $800,000 in his will so that you can pursue a quality education." Hearing this, Craig and his father become deeply emotional. It's clear that Mr. Harrigan cared about Craig's future and wanted to ensure he had the best opportunity. Later that evening, Craig returns home. Missing Mr. Harrigan, he picks up his phone and records a voice message. With his voice trembling, he says, "I'm so sorry I lost you. I loved you like family. If I could have you back, I wouldn't care about the money, because no one in this world can take your place. I miss every moment we spent together." Craig sends the message to Mr. Harrigan's number, knowing he won't receive a reply. With a heavy heart, he puts the phone down and falls asleep. The next morning, Craig is shocked to find a reply from Mr. Harrigan's phone. He's left speechless, knowing he placed the phone in Mr. Harrigan's pocket before his burial. Filled with confusion and fear, he rushes to his father and shares everything. His father, trying to make sense of it, says, "Maybe someone's playing a cruel prank on you." But Craig, overwhelmed, suggests, "We need to go to the graveyard and check his grave. What if he's still alive?" His father firmly responds, "The doctor's report clearly stated he passed away. You need to stop imagining things and let it go." Realizing the logic, Craig reluctantly agrees and tries to calm down. Despite his efforts to move on, Craig finds himself visiting Mr. Harrigan's grave every day. The sense of loss remains heavy, but he continues to focus on his studies, knowing it's what Mr. Harrigan would have wanted. One day at school, Craig notices a commotion. Kenny, the bully who had tormented him before, is caught by authorities for selling drugs on school premises. Kenny blames Craig for his downfall and becomes furious. On annual day, Kenny confronts Craig, beating him badly in anger. Though the teachers intervene, they choose not to report the incident to higher authority, leaving Craig to deal with the emotional and physical pain alone. That night, Craig once again picks up his phone and sends a voice message to Mr. Harrigan's number, sharing everything that happened. He knows there won't be a reply this time, but speaking to Mr. Harrigan, even through the phone, gives him comfort. It's his way of keeping their bond alive, despite knowing Mr. Harrigan is gone. Just as Craig finishes sending his message, he receives a shocking reply. He is dead. Startled and confused, Craig decides to investigate further. He rushes to the place where Kenny's body is discovered. Upon reaching the scene, Craig learns that Kenny had consumed excessive alcohol and fell from a height, resulting in his death. However, something about the situation feels off to Craig. He closely examines Kenny's body and notices an unusual detail. His hands are smeared with shoe polish, and there's also some polish on his mouth. This discovery triggers Craig's memory of his first encounter with Kenny. He recalls how Kenny had bullied him, saying, "Either clean my shoes with this polish, or you'll eat it." Craig realizes that the same shoe polish is now linked to Kenny's death. Feeling a chill down his spine, Craig becomes convinced that Mr. Harrigan's spirit had something to do with it. Determined to uncover the truth, Craig decides to dig deeper into the mysterious events surrounding Mr. Harrigan's phone. He visits one of Mr. Harrigan's former employees to investigate. During their conversation, Craig learns that the employee was fired from the company years ago after being caught stealing. Shockingly, a few days after their meeting, the former employee also dies under mysterious circumstances. At this point, Craig becomes convinced that Mr. Harrigan's spirit is responsible for these strange deaths. To put an end to the eerie connection, Craig records one final voice message to Mr. Harrigan, apologizing and expressing his gratitude. He then places the phone in a box and buries it, hoping to finally let go of the haunting event. With his high school years behind him, Craig moves to Boston to study journalism. Life begins to feel normal again, and he starts focusing on his future. One day, however, Craig receives a devastating phone call from his father. His father shares the heartbreaking news: Craig's favorite high school teacher, who had always supported him, has died in a car accident. Craig is deeply shaken by the loss, as his teacher had been a pillar of encouragement throughout his life. Craig returns to his hometown to pay his respects. While there, he learns the details of the tragedy. The accident was caused by a man named Whitmore, who was driving under the influence of alcohol. The reckless driver's actions led to the untimely death of Craig's beloved teacher. Craig and his friends are outraged by the court's decision to send Whitmore, a repeat offender of drunk driving, to a rehab center for just 6 months. They feel this is not a punishment, but a leniency that lets him escape justice. Craig, determined to see Whitmore pay for his actions, decides to take matters into his own hand. He retrieves the box containing Mr. Harrigan's iPhone, which he had buried to sever their supernatural connection. Desperate for justice, Craig sends a voice message to Mr. Harrigan saying, "Whitmore doesn't deserve to live. His reckless actions took the life of an innocent person." The next day, Craig learns that Whitmore was found dead in the rehab center. Reports reveal that he died while taking a shower, and the cause of death remains unclear. This event sends a chilling realization through Craig. Mr. Harrigan's spirit might still be responding to his messages. Haunted by guilt and fear, Craig starts to question if he is responsible for Whitmore's death, just as he suspected in Kenny's case. To uncover the truth, he visits Mr. Harrigan's mansion, hoping to find any evidence of supernatural activity or clues about the connection between the phone and the mysterious deaths. While searching the house, Craig finds nothing unusual until he opens Mr. Harrigan's closet. Inside, he discovers an old photograph of Mr. Harrigan from his childhood. The photo, though seemingly innocent, feels eerily significant to Craig, leaving him with more questions than answers. Craig reflects on this, realizing it answers the biggest question of his life: why Mr. Harrigan had chosen him in the first place. He finally understands that Mr. Harrigan saw a part of himself in Craig, which is why he cared for him deeply and connected with him on a spiritual level. Craig visits Mr. Harrigan's grave and says, "I didn't understand your messages before, but now I do. You wanted me to let go, to stop trying to contact you. I see now that you cared for me because you saw yourself." Craig then visits his mother's grave, a place he hadn't gone to since childhood. Overwhelmed with emotion, he breaks down, crying for the loss and guilt he had carried for so many years. Finally, Craig goes to a lake, taking with him the iPhone that he had used to send messages to Mr. Harrigan. The phone, which had been his connection to Mr. Harrigan's spirit, is now something he needs to let go of. He throws the iPhone into the lake, symbolizing his decision to move on. He briefly considers throwing away his current phone, but stops. In today's world, life without a phone seems almost impossible. Instead, he decides to keep it, but resolves to never use it in the same way again. In the final scene, Craig's voice narrates, "When I'm buried, make sure my grave is left completely empty. No phone, nothing. Some things should stay buried." The story ends here, leaving the audience to ponder its deeper meaning. What did this story mean to you? Share your thoughts in the comments. We hope you enjoyed this gripping and thought-provoking tale.